folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Digest. It's episode 52. Thank you guys very much for listening lately. I've been featuring a lot of great shows. At least I think they've been, and a lot of you have told me that you've been adding to your subscription list lately, so that makes me very happy that you guys are finding out about some of the great stuff that I've been listening to. This week's show, episode 52, is going to be a little departure. Kind of going back to the origins of the Podcast Digest and something I'd done back in episode 28 and episode 38. If you've been a long-time listener, you know that on occasion I've done what I call recommendation shows. And in those two episodes I mentioned, I have brought on a co-host. Back in episode 28 was Diamond Dave Meyer, and episode 38 was Ryan Steiner from Ryan's Podcast Reviews. And so here on episode 52, I'm doing it again, and I sought out another voracious podcast fan, one from the Podcast Digest back catalog as well, and somebody that is not a stranger to any listener of this particular show. Molly Mendenhall from Couple Things Podcast is my co-host this week. Molly, welcome back to the Podcast Digest.
Hey, Dan. Thanks so much for having me back on the show.
Well, I am very happy that you're able to join me this week, and we're going to talk about something we both love, which is podcasts. So, but before we do that, I hope that maybe, just maybe, somebody is finding this show for the first time, and hopefully they like what they're hearing. And if that's the case, I want them to know a little bit about you and your show. So for folks just now hearing your voice for the first time, tell them a little bit about yourself and about your podcast.
Okay, well, I am Molly. I am one of the 4 podcasters from Couple Things Podcast. We are 2 married couples who sit around and discuss 4 different topics in kind of a barroom style fashion. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or any listening app of your choice. And we also have a great website. I know a lot of people don't check out websites these days, but I highly recommend it. It's couplethingspodcast.com. And as for social media, we're out there on Twitter, just like you, Dan, and at Couple Things Pod, or you can find us on Facebook or Instagram.
Hey, you brought up that website, and you're right. You guys have been making a lot of improvements to that lately. For folks who have been longtime listeners of the Podcast Digest, you will have heard Molly before and Couple Things. They were previous guests back on episode 42. But since then, and kind of ongoing, you guys have been adding some things to the website, right?
Yes, we have. We've added recently some podcast reviews. So each month, kind of like what we're doing here, we're picking 2 podcasts that we're absolutely in love with and that all 4 of us listen to, and kind of are reviewing them, putting their names out there for them with links and, you know, how to check them out. And we're also pretty soon going to possibly have a store available, but you didn't hear that from me.
No, I didn't. But because you did bring up the store, if you're listening to this right now, the Podcast Digest has just offered a new round of merchandise. Go to the website, podcastdigest.info, thepodcastdigest.info, I'm sorry. And the latest blog post does talk about a whole new round of shirts and hoodies and long sleeve shirts and colors and all kinds of things I didn't do in my first offering. Open till, I think, like the 3rd week of August. So if anybody's interested in that, I would be humbled if you pick one up. But anyways, back to a couple things before we get into the meat of the show. I mentioned that you and your 3 co-hosts were guests on episode 42, but I wanted to mention this to you, Molly. I'm not sure if you remembered this or caught this. Episode 42 was not the first time I discussed Couple Things Podcast here on this show. The very first time I did was actually, and this is sort of ironic, the last time I did a recommendation episode I'd mentioned was episode 38 with Ryan Steiner. Mm-hmm. On that episode, that was published on May 10th, was when I first recommended to all of you folks listening to check out Couple Things. But what's interesting was I had 2 shows to talk about that night. Couple Things was one. The other one was Aaron Mahnke's Lore. Ironically enough, that show has become a huge breakout hit, constantly towards the top of the iTunes charts. Aaron recently mentioned he passed 1.5 million downloads on his show. So those were my 2 recommendations that night, Aaron Mahnke's Lore and Couple Things. So that's pretty good company to be in.
That's fantastic company to be, and we kind of need some of their magic juju to kind of come our direction. 1.5 million is rather impressive.
It certainly is, and Aaron's really kind of been taken aback, I think, by how well his show has performed, and justifiably so. If anyone has listened to Lore, you will understand why his show has gone gangbusters. But
so it went to 1.5 million because he was on your show, correct?
I doubt that. But I'd like to think, maybe, 3 or 4 of those downloads were because of the show.
Absolutely, I would say so.
That's what I'm thinking. But a couple things has been doing extraordinarily well for you guys as well. You've recently come off a huge month of guest appearance spots on the Stranger Conversations, also previous guests here on the Podcast Digest. And I know you guys have been talking at length about that. But just as a quick summary for anyone who is just dropping in on this episode, tell them a little bit about that experience and maybe where they can find those shows.
So Grant Markham has a podcast called The Stranger Conversations, and he was gracious enough to come up with the genius idea of Couple Things Podcast in July. He kind of coined it CTP in July, and he took all 4 of us, myself, my husband Ben, Ray, and his wife Vaughn, and interviewed us all solo. So these are about an hour to 2 hour episodes, kind of getting to know us personally, and almost kind of made it into a social experiment, kind of toyed with kind of interacting our stories together, and each of us were asked the same 10 questions, and then we kind of had to guess to see what our counterparts would have said. And he really did a great job bringing it all together. And then in the 5th and final episode of CTP in July, he had all 4 of us guest on what he called the roundtable. And actually, yourself, Dan Lizette, was our surprise guest host, which was fantastic. And we all got to kind of embark back on the journey together, what we learned, what we didn't know, what was, a new experience for all of us. And it was really, really a great experience to guest on that podcast. And you can find him on iTunes at The Stranger Conversation and also on Twitter. And Grant is just a fantastic host.
And it was a fantastic experience to be a part of that 5th and final installment of that series, as well as a listener to the first 4, each of you individually, and your appearances. And folks, we're going to talk about on this recommendation episodes a lot of shows that you should be adding and subscribing to. But as previously mentioned, Molly's show, along with her husband and their friends, Couple Things, and Grant Markham's show, Stranger Conversations, are additional subscriptions that you should be making and checking out, in addition to some of the things we're about to talk about. But before we get to those, kind of my next segment, if you will, of my attempt at structure with these type of episodes is what I call the discussion section of this entry. And actually, you just mentioned something that was a great segue to that, and that is the idea of guests. Being one, having them on your own shows, maybe recruiting them. I know a lot of people out there listening are other podcasters. Maybe you're considering having guests. Maybe you've had some and struggled at it. Maybe you would like to guest on other shows. In fact, that's something that came out of the Stranger Conversations experience for you guys as well, Molly, correct?
Absolutely. We've really been toying around with the idea of having our first guest on the podcast. It's kind of a new struggle for us because we're not really sure how to go about it. Do we Skype with them? Do we do it in person? And, that's something we've really been trying to work on because we want to get guests on the show and kind of reciprocate for them having us on their shows.
And that's a great place to start the conversation. So from the perspective of being a podcaster, some of you may be considering the idea of bringing guests on, and that is a great first question to ask. Should we do it via Skype? Should we do it in person? Now, I've had, obviously, for those of you who've been listening to the Podcast Digest for a while, plenty of Skype guests. Molly and I tonight are on Skype. But I've also had the opportunity on 2 of my episodes to have in-person guests. One was just my brother in kind of a holiday experiment last year in the end of November. But one was not that long ago, and that was Taylor Martin, who is actually a podcaster and a guy who came to my house, and I did not know him prior to him arriving at my front door, not personally anyways. And we had what I thought was a great episode, and it was awesome to talk to him in person. And there is a huge difference between podcasting with somebody via the internet and podcasting with somebody in person. The first and most obvious, and people may, obviously know this, but file this quickly, but it may not really settle on them how legitimately different this is the idea of just being able to make eye contact with somebody. It's a completely different experience. So you guys, you mentioned that you're sort of toying with the idea, kind of going both directions. Are you guys sort of weighing those pros and cons as well?
We are. We actually may have our first guest coming on in the beginning of September, and they're going to be a live guest, because something you just said is the eye contact, Dan. Actually having the person there in front of you and just verbal cues, knowing if they're going to speak so you don't speak over them, kind of thing.
But it is a big difference. And I had no idea, the first time I did it in November of last year with my brother, I don't think it really counted because I'm so used to speaking to him either over the phone or in person all my life. But when Taylor was here, that was a big deal. That was a huge difference. And I think if anyone were to listen to that episode, if there's anybody who listens to this show very closely, that was episode 46, released on June 28th, Taylor Martin from Untethered and Mod. Taylor and I had a completely different back and forth, I felt, because it's really interesting when you can look at somebody's face and eyes and kind of as they're talking, you see them maybe wrapping up a response and they look back at you and you can kind of free flow in the conversation and you're not waiting or dealing with any latency from Skype or anything of that nature. So I'm a big fan in person if you can make it happen. That said, it also obviously very much limits your ability to have guests, because if you strictly do that, you're depending on people you know personally, people who live in your local area or are willing to travel to you, and you kind of have to roll the dice, right? Making sure this person's not a serial killer who's coming over.
Exactly.
But what about the idea of finding guests? That is a huge thing. I've fielded a lot of questions, that being basically an interview show. I have fielded a ton of those, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But how do you guys feel about that potential as you guys are considering bringing on guests? What about the idea of recruiting them?
Well, I think one great aspect of our show is the fact that, unlike your show where you're interviewing other great podcasters and, most everyone has a podcast or a podcast website or some form of that, our show really brings in the fact that we can talk to anyone, because the style of our show is any topic that you want to bring to the table, no matter what it is, because someone will have an opinion on it. So we could bring in a parent, a sister, another podcaster, a group of podcasters. That really opens up the door of possibilities for us that we can talk to anyone. So I think the finding the guests will be a bit easier. We've already had some people, say, are you taking guests yet? We'd love to come on. Right now we're trying to work out how we're going to do it, how to record from this end. Those are all things that as new podcasters, we just don't know how to do yet.
And let's talk about that real quick. And for folks who are also facing some of the same questions, other new podcasters who could be listening to this. So here's what I use. If you're on a Mac, I use Call Recorder by Ecamm. That is the piece of software that I use. I think it's $30, not a trial.
Trial.
And $30, and it's a one-time purchase. It's not a subscription or anything of that nature. It records very well to a desktop folder that they create called Saved Calls. It comes right up into something that you can import very easily into your editing software of choice. So that's what I use. I know a lot of people on Windows. There are free programs like Pamela that I'm aware of, and I think there are a couple others as well that people do. And some people have tried to use Hangouts. I have done that one time, and I would prefer to never do it again. It basically auto-records a YouTube video, and then you have to import the YouTube video and tear off your audio from the video, and it becomes not nearly as easy a process as something like Ecamm Call Recorder. But those are a couple of options that I think folks could look into to potentially start the process, at least via Skype.
Those sound like pretty good options. See, you're someone who's experienced, so I feel like that really does help out the new podcaster on kind of what direction to go into.
And then here's the other thing on the in-person side, right? And I've mentioned this a couple of times in previous episodes. So here's the deal. If you're a solo podcaster, or maybe just you and a friend or you and a spouse, and if you've been using USB microphones up to now, I used to, the Blue Yeti, I'm still looking at my Blue Yeti, that plugs straight into your computer to record. If you're going to bring in an in-person guest, now you have hardware issues. I was just describing some software upgrades or purchases you may need to make, but in person, on a hardware side, you may also need to switch to a mixer, to USB, XLR to XLR microphones, and then go from there. And there's a lot of great resources out there. Actually, on my website, I've got a couple of articles I've already pulled together at the podcastdigest.info. On the right-hand side is resources for podcasters talking about how to set up the mixer, how to move to in-person guests. And it can be complicated. And I did a lot of Googling, watched a lot of YouTube videos to kind of get the setup straight for either. But it is a change from sort of the existing setup to bringing in guests.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that your website's a great resource for people to start at and kind of figure out where they're going. I know Ray, which is one of the 4 members of Couple Things Podcast, he is our guy who's basically in charge of all that. He does our editing, he does our setup. And you're right. Right now we do 4 USBs into the back of our iMac. So hardware does become an issue for the live guests that we want to have in September.
Yep, it starts to become a different situation. And, the solutions are out there. I said all the time, if I had one regret from the start of my show to now is that I would have gone, XLR from Jump Street, because I quickly wanted to have guests, and then I realized, I've got to spend more money. And that's aggravating, but it's kind of like, a passion like anything else, or a hobby like anything else, that if it is something that you want to do and pursue, it kind of starts to become required purchases. But what about this concept? And this will be something I'm curious as you guys kind of set out on this road. Are you worried, or are you concerned in any way? Because I'll be honest and say this is something that was a concern of mine, that bringing in guests and their potential personalities, their approach, their style, their input might detract from what I hope you guys feel up to this point has been a high quality, super entertaining show with a dynamic between the 4 of you that a lot of people have taken to. Are you guys concerned with that at all?
I think that's always a concern. But I do believe that the guests always kind of bring something new to the show and exciting. And I think once we start having guests, it will be not every episode. It'll be more of an infrequent thing, kind of almost like a bonus. So I don't know that it would necessarily, I guess it does worry me a little bit, but I think that they could bring something new to the table, almost kind of like you, Dan. You're like an idea factory. We always get new ideas from you. So they could come on the show and bring a whole new aspect that we love, and then a couple things might explode from there. So I think you have to go into it with, the possibility that these guests really could bring your show to that next level. Speaking of ideas, one of the things when I heard you guys were starting to consider guests, I always thought, my first thought was, and I did dispel this because it would be somewhat limiting, but boy, it would be really cool that if the only guests you guys brought on were other couples. We have toyed around with that a lot. And actually, the first guest we will probably be having on in September is, in fact, another couple. Well, you could maintain that, or at least maybe that could be a theme. If it's not every single guest, maybe that could be kind of a preference, just to maintain that dynamic. I think it'd be super cool. I think it brings a really cool dynamic. You don't listen to a lot of podcasts out there right now that are husband and wife or other couples. Yeah, I think so. I think that would be an awesome thing. I want to talk just a little bit about the idea of recruiting for those who may not have as wide a audience where they could pull in people to appear as guests as you guys are planning on doing. I know for me and for a lot of shows out there, people may have video game podcasts, people may have comic book podcasts, people may have sports podcasts, and then obviously their audience that they could potentially pull from to bring on guests becomes a little more narrower. And I've faced the same thing because there's a certain style of show I'd like to feature. There, a world of shows that I'd like to recommend and to have appear. And then there are those that would love to appear, from what I've heard, but I wouldn't have them. And that's simply because, I'm trying to control the product that I'm putting forward. So what folks will find themselves in the position of doing is, shooting out emails, mentions on Twitter, interacting with people they've not had interactions before, and then asking if they would be willing to make an appearance. And I've had the whole gamut of experiences here. So I wanted to throw out just a couple of tips, and I want to be clear as well. I'm no professional. I haven't hit a year yet. I'm 52 episodes in, which is pretty good, but I've still got a lot to learn. So these are only a few of the things I know at this point.
One is that if you do end up shooting out emails, which is kind of the standard approach, which is what I've done, is my primary form of trying to recruit guests, is try to be as clear and concise as you possibly can. Don't be too long and rambling. Make sure that you spell check. Make sure there's no grammatical errors. Make sure that your website is as good as you can possibly make it. And I'm the first one to say I don't love my website. I've said that before. It is a Google site. It is Blogger, and I really want to do something more, but I feel like I'm so far down the track. I'm worried about how I can convert something over. But because your website should be in your signature of that email, and if you're lucky enough, people will check out that website to figure out, are you professional enough, or are you representing something they want to add their voice to? And so it better be decent. And also, allow for time. Don't blow smoke up people, and just make sure you're honest. The other thing, too, is to potentially point out previous things you've done. If people feel like, well, I want to be a part of that based on who else they've talked to, you're a lot likely to get a more positive response. Obviously, that means when you're first starting out, it could be a little more difficult, but a lot of that is, catching some breaks in the early part. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the idea of kind of blankly shooting out emails, because I know a lot of people struggle with that. I did.
Absolutely. We've shot out a few emails as well, and the timbre might be one of them.
Hey, there you go. And that was a wonderful conversation. Very fortunate. That was my 50th episode with Devin Taylor from the Timbre. And if anybody hasn't heard that, go back and listen to that. One of my favorite shows and a great conversationalist.
Yeah, Devin was really fun to listen to.
Yeah, she was great. That's for sure. So that's our discussion topic, folks. Hopefully you got something good out of that, I hope. So let's move into our recommendations. We've got a lot of things to recommend. Both Molly and I have brought 2 shows to talk to you guys about. Molly, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first?
It's up to you, Dan. We should just, I can go first if you like.
Sure. Ladies first. What's your first show you'd like to talk about?
So the first show I want to talk about is a fantastic show that I have stumbled upon, and it was very hard for me to narrow down to 2 top picks because a lot of my favorite shows, you have already interviewed them. So I really had to narrow it down. And the first one is called Science Versus. So for you listeners out there, this is a top 50 iTunes podcast. And the host of this podcast is Wendy Zuckerman. She is a fantastic Australian voice. She basically pits fad against fact. So she will take any of the latest fads out there that are framing themselves as scientific fact, and she tries to find the truth below them. So outside of the podcast, she's actually a science journalist. So she brings that aspect to the podcast. And she's also a producer, I want to say, of Radio National. And they're short episodes. They're easy to listen to. They're 15 to 20 minutes long, each one. She's had about 11 so far, and she's actually on hiatus right now as she's putting together her new shows. And it is a great show, and it has such high production value, which is part of why I love it. She has catchy intro songs. She always kind of breaks each scientific fad versus fact down into segments, and kind of at the end always goes, in conclusion, and she'll give a point to the fad side, or she'll give a point to the fact side. And she really takes, what is cool is she takes these normal claims and kind of compares them against the science-based evidence. So she'll have, scientists and doctors and astronomers on the show to kind of, weigh their side, but throws in her witty humor on top of it. And she really just brings like a light-hearted aspect to these scientific topics. And she puts such a spin on it that each week you're just drawn back, and she is a fantastic host.
And I was really excited when you told me that this was one of the ones you wanted to talk about, because this is one currently not in my subscription list. I've seen you tweet about it and seen your enthusiasm for it. And based on this description, this sounds like something that needs to be a part of my subscription list.
Oh, absolutely. If you are going to listen, I highly recommend that you start with episode 6. It's my personal favorite. It is actually on pornography. So she takes pornography and she brings in doctors who talk about, is it addictive? Is it not addictive? And then she brings on normal, everyday people who, in fact, do watch pornography, and they tell their stories. They recount how their sex lives have had kind of been ruined. And she puts such a witty spin onto it that it's just hilarious, but yet you're still learning science-based evidence on top of it. So she does a fantastic job.
Well, folks, if that does not intrigue you enough to subscribe, I'm really not sure what it would take at this point. That sounds wildly interesting. For sure. And I'm going to be talking about this as well, and I've learned this, and I hate to say this because I don't follow this rule, but there is something about the shorter episodes that makes it wildly appealing in the concept, especially if they have a shorter back catalog that you can just blow through. This sounds like something that if somebody liked episode 6, they could easily pick them all up real quick.
Oh, absolutely. Much like my favorite podcaster, Helen Zaltzman with The Illusionist, Wendy Zuckerman's are just as short. You can listen to them on your way to work. They're perfect for, when you don't have a lot of time, but you're still in the mood for a good podcast.
Well, that is Molly's first recommendation, folks, Science Verse, and that show link, as well as all the shows that we're going to be talking about in the balance of the show, will all be linked up in the show notes as well. So I'm trying to make it really easy for you to just go and hit subscribe on all these other great shows that Molly and I are talking about. So my first show recommendation, and I want to point this out, I know I've been talking about my website more than really any episode I can remember, but on my website, thepodcastdigest.info, on the right-hand side, you will see a little link where it says, recommend a podcast yourself. And I created this a couple months ago because I've been under a slight deluge of Twitter mentions, direct messages, emails, everything short of a text, I like to say, with people asking me to check out different shows, which is great. But I went ahead and created a form that is on the right-hand side of that website that allows anyone, anywhere, anytime, host, listener, friend, family member, to tell me about a great show that they love. And my first show comes directly from that submission list. So those of you who've put your shows into there, do not think I am not reading it or checking it out. I reference it a couple of times a week as I'm flipping through my subscription list, and this first recommendation this week comes directly from that giant spreadsheet. I'm up to approaching 70 shows that folks have told me about so far. And this show is really unique, and unique in the sense of a lot of the podcasts I've heard, but not in the sense of something I haven't talked about before. I'll explain that. It's called The Distance. Website for the show is thedistance.com. They are on Twitter at DistanceMag. The host is Waylon Wong. Now, the reason I say this is somewhat similar to something I've talked about is that this show represents kind of this burgeoning pattern, or this frequent occurrence, or ever-increasing frequent occurrences, where there are businesses that are creating sort of an arm of their promotion that is a podcast, except the podcast by itself is excellent content that just so happens to be sponsored and built by a company. We mentioned episode 50 with Devin Taylor of the Timbre. I talked about Slack Variety Pack. That is mentioned by a communication app called Slack, and they are creating a podcast that is excellent called the Slack Variety Pack. This one's similar. This is from a production or a productivity software company called Basecamp, and they have a podcast called The Distance. And what they are doing is highlighting mom and pop style private long-term businesses that have been around for at least 25 years or more all across the country. They are doing these short little interview-based episodes. They're between 10 and 15 minutes long, and their idea is, and they have a special episode 6.5, talking to the CEO of Basecamp and talking about why are they doing this podcast and what's the point. Well, one of the point is Basecamp's been around for 16 years, and they want to know from other companies that have been around a long time, what are some of their secrets? What are some of their, success stories or challenges, and how have these small companies been around so long and served their client bases so passionately, and kind of what has made them work? So these guys have gone around. It is an every 2 weeks or twice a month podcast, and Waylon Wong is the host. She does an excellent job of interviewing and narrating these episodes, and they feature some of the most interesting businesses that every one of us have seen before, possibly in their own small town. So they've done things like laundromats. They've done things like, auto wrecker services. They've done things like tailors and various different companies that box makers, really unique mom and pop businesses. They talk to the company that built the original patty maker for fast food restaurants. I think back on episode 2. And again, sort of like I mentioned with Slack Variety Pack, they're not selling you a product. They're simply telling a story about a great homegrown business and its effect on the community. And there's some really interesting stories going on. And this has been added to my subscription list. I love the work that Waylon is doing with this show and the team there at Basecamp. It's a really interesting show. You don't have to be a business mind. It's not business heavy. They're more like stories using the business as a backdrop. It really mixes on sort of those on-site interviews, background music, narration, a really high production value. So that's my first recommendation, called The Distance. Have you heard of that one?
That's really interesting. I've never heard of a subculture of companies putting out podcasts. That's very intriguing.
It seems to be happening more and more. This is the second one in the last month that I've come across, and it's a really unique idea where it appears as if a brand or an app or a company, of course, these are all oftentimes so far kind of technology-based companies that are just sort of seizing the medium to create something people would like, to obviously build kind of this goodwill surrounding the name of the organization. And I can tell you it's working, at least for me.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, podcasts are kind of the thing right now, so they're kind of on the home front. That's a great idea in my opinion. Yeah,
and I can tell you, anyone who has even the most mild interest in how I've described it will really enjoy The Distance. It's some really neat stuff. It really is.
I'm going to have to check that one out.
It's a good one. Molly, what's your second show recommendation?
All right. I'm going with the big one here, Dan.
Okay.
My second recommendation was the number one on the chart. And you might notice I'm kind of got a different theme going here with female voices. And this one is Starlee Kine of Mystery Show. So this is a fantastic show brought to you by Gimlet. And she was number one on the charts for a while. Now I believe she's like in the top 20 because she's actually taking a break. But there's been 6 episodes so far. Each one are about 45 minutes to an hour long. And she basically takes mysteries of the everyday world and puts a fun kind of spin on them. So she takes mysteries that can't be solved online and goes out and solves them. It could be a person that she's known for a long time. It could be a stranger on the street. And what's really cool is, it's down to, she did an episode on a belt buckle. A friend of hers had this belt buckle and he really wanted to return it to the original owner because he felt, it was probably very important to him. And all of her mysteries almost seem to be magical. Like when she solves them, they all kind of have neat backgrounds and stories. And just like, Wendy Zuckerman shows Science Versus, the production value of the show is very high. She has great intro and outro music. She had, bands put the songs together and they're catchy. I caught myself at work the other day even singing her intro song. Starlee Kine herself has this very unique voice. She kind of started as a writer, I believe, for the New York Times and decided she wanted to do a podcast because she loves mysteries. She's always watched Law and Order growing up, and she talked about that on her show, and her voice draws you in. My husband's always like, I can't wait for her new episode to come on. I just want to listen to her. She's fantastic. And I think if you're a listener out there and you want to give Mystery Show a chance, I would start with the Britney Spears episode. It is highly intriguing, and I think you'll really enjoy it.
Absolutely. Boy, I could not endorse something more than your recommendation of Mystery Show. And folks, I imagine a lot of you have already heard of Mystery Show. It has really taken the 2015 podcasting world by storm, and justifiably so. It is, production values and entertainment and what have you. It's if I knew somebody who got their first smartphone and said, "Oh, what's a podcast?" and I were to download, sort of like 5 of the baseline shows, Mystery Show's probably in there. Because I don't know of anyone who would not or should not enjoy this show.
I love the aspect of taking daily things that vex people and turning it into a show and something to be solved. It's not taking, high crimes and trying to figure out who did it. It's taking simple, everyday, I wonder what that license plate means, finding the owner and asking them. And the stories that she finds along the way with the people she interacts with are just heartwarming. And, they really just draw you in. It might not even be part of the bigger mystery, but then you meet these individuals along the way that kind of touch you. So she does a fantastic show.
Or how tall is Jake Gyllenhaal?
Everyone on the internet really wanted to know.
And, and what's interesting about, Starly and as well as Gimlet as a whole is that I have kind of been around Gimlet in a lot of the things that I've featured. I've talked with Alex Goldman from Reply All, another Gimlet show. And so I'm a big fan of anything coming out of Gimlet right now between Startup and Reply All and Mystery Show. I mean, that is another great place to start your subscription list. Starly's been on Brian Koppelman's show, The Moment, and it was an excellent interview her and Brian did a couple weeks back, and I've had Brian Koppelman on this show. So there is a lot of good things going on, and you can kind of keep going with your subscription list. You could start with Mystery Show, and then you really would want to hear either the other work being done by Gimlet, or if you want to hear even more talk about Mystery Show and really go behind the scenes, that's what Brian Koppelman did recently on his show, The Moment. And there's just so much good stuff out there between all these shows.
Absolutely. I think she actually did a couple features as well on This American Life. So
yeah, I think she is one of those This American Life alums, if you will, or at least has dropped in a time or two for sure. So that is an interesting, and what was funny, you mentioned this, you brought this up. I was debating on doing so, but because you brought it up, I will highlight it. When you mentioned female voices, I'll be honest with all you folks listening right now. I will tell you a little bit behind the scenes of the Podcast Digest. So going back into like episodes, late teens, early 20s, as I moved into the late 20s, I had a conversation with someone, and I said, I really would like to make a concerted effort to make sure I have more female podcast hosts and producers on my show, because I listen to a lot of them, and there's so much great work being done out there, and I want to make sure that I am representing these things on the Podcast Digest. And so those of you who know the back catalog, these are the times when I've talked with Vanessa Lowe, Phoebe Judge, Helen Zaltzman, Sarah Stewart, and all those shows got featured in. And then what happened was I sort of went back the other way again, and it became a little male heavy in terms of that. And so not even intentionally, I found myself going back again the other way. So Devin Taylor was a couple of weeks ago, and last week I had Karina Longworth from You Must Remember This, and of course Molly's my co-host this week. And so far in our recommendation list, I've recommended The Distance, which is hosted by Waylon Wong, and we've got Science Versus, Mystery Show, and so our first three show recommendations are all women hosts, and with good reason. And to be honest with you, when I was putting together this list, I didn't even think about it, and it was only after this was all assembled I realized exactly what was happening here to maintain that theme. So my second show recommendation is also hosted by another excellent woman podcast producer.
4 for 4.
Isn't that amazing? And it's not even intentional. And that's the best part, right? We just picked great shows, and it just so happened to come out this way. And it represents exactly what the thought process I had was back in those early episodes. It's just that there's so much great stuff out there. And this one it really holds a special place in my heart, if you will. It is now I have to go back and look. I want to say fourth. Yes, this will be the fourth show of 6 shows as a part of this collective that I have mentioned or featured here on the Podcast Digest. The collective is The Herd, and the show is First Day Back with Tally Abacassis. And I really hope I'm saying your name right, Tally. Big fan of this show since I came across it several months ago. The only downfall of this show is there's not more episodes, and I know that she's working on them. But First Day Back chronicles the story of Tally Abacassis. She is a documentary filmmaker who has been on what she calls the world's longest extended maternity leave. She has been on leave for over 6 years after having 2 children, and she is chronicling her return to the work world as a documentary filmmaker. I don't know how she came up with this idea or what made her think that this could potentially be something folks are interested in, but wow, it has received a lot of acclaim. A lot of people have talked about it, and when you talk about if you are a parent, if you know someone who's a parent, or especially if you're a parent, and in most cases we're talking about mothers here, but and I'll talk about this in a second. Tally does feature some stories with fathers as well, who have left the work world to raise children and then ever attempted to get back into it. This is a show that will really strike a chord for you. She, from her website, she says she takes a real-life look at motherhood, gender roles, and work-life balance in a voice that turns serious, funny, and sometimes touching. She's got everything in this show. Her own inner thoughts. She does interviews. This is a real-life drama that really asks a lot of big questions that really millions of parents go through all across the world, and that's, taking the time away to raise your kids and then the ultimate drive to return back to work. And she basically is documenting what this process is like. She's from Canada, Montreal area, and she doesn't just document step by step or, kind of recount what happened. She talks to colleagues. She has a recorder with her. She talks about, her successes and failures, her frustrations, and those things she wants to celebrate. And she's even had conversations with her oldest son and including them in the podcast. And those were some of the most interesting conversations. She asked her son, like, should mommy go back to work? And I won't spoil the reply, but really intriguing conversation. At the time we're talking about this right now, there are 8 episodes out there. And like I said, the only bad thing is I really wish there was more. But the last one was a bit of a deviation from kind of everything I've been describing. And she had asked for listener feedback, anyone else who had been in this position or their thoughts with their experience. And while First Day Back has typically clocked in somewhere around that 20 to 30 minute range, this was like an 80+ minute episode of amazing stories from across the country, from both mothers and fathers, and what their experience has been like, what it's like dealing with family members, with coworkers, with colleagues, with themselves, with their kids, and what this process has been like. Episode 8 was amazing, and something that anyone, whether they're parents or working or both or what have you, anyone I think would really enjoy what Tally has done with First Day Back. And I, for one, cannot wait until the next episode or to see where this story goes, because highly produced, wonderful production value. She is a member of the Herd Collective. I am a huge fan. I mentioned earlier with Gimlet, if somebody were to go to Radiotopia, Gimlet, and The Herd and just subscribe to all their shows, it is more than enough listening to get anyone through a week or a month or whatever the case may be. All the shows on The Herd are excellent, and this is yet another one of them, and I'm so happy to have a chance to talk about it and the great work that Tally Abacassis is doing with First Day Back. That's my our fourth recommendation, my second. Molly, have you heard of First Day Back?
No, but I think First Day Back is going to do exceptionally well just because of how unique it is. Think of how many women there are in the world and how difficult it is for those women when they do have to go back to work. And now she's bringing that to their ears to help get them through it. So I think that she is going to do exceptionally well with this concept.
And that's exactly the element that really came to light in her latest episode when she asked for the listener feedback and stories. And she says she was blown away by the response. And it almost seemed, just like you said, Molly, that there were so many people out there just fiending this connection with somebody else who's in their earbuds now of kind of this shared experience, who understood where they were coming from. And it was amazing because, I've not personally been in this situation, but I can imagine there has got to be so much loneliness in this concept when you are just clawing and struggling to kind of get back to what, in some way, shape, or form, what you once were, right? Or what you believe you still can be, or what you're capable of, and kind of, reestablishing, that type of professional pride. Should that be your desire? And that's what, Tally talks about. Should somebody choose to do that? And it just got to seem like a really lonely process. And this show has really resonated with people as far as I can tell.
I bet you it's probably very comforting to know, you know what, I'm not alone. There's someone else out there that's going through the exact same thing I am, and they can take it step by step with that person. So I think her concept is really going to hit home with a lot of people because there's so many different aspects to look at. I know from my sister and some of my friends' experiences that it's scary and it's frightening, and you don't know how you're going to do when you go back to work. And then when you do go back to work, you're worried about your children at home all day long. And there's this very fine balance that it seems. So I bet a lot of people are probably finding comfort in her show.
I would think so. And understandably so. And it is an excellent show. And to know that by and large, it's her. And she may have a little bit of help with editing or music or what have you, but by and large, this is her production. She's got a great picture on her website saying the First Day Back Studios, and there's a little, I believe it's like a kid's pop-up tent set up in her living room where there's a microphone and a laptop in there where apparently she has gone to record because obviously, she's got two young kids running around, and I guess this is how she tries to soundproof things. It's right on the website. It's pretty amazing. But I couldn't recommend First Day Back any higher. It gets my full star rating, whatever. I should come up with some kind of rating or recommendation system. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like Dan approved.
Yeah, or something, I don't know, 4 digests up or something. I don't know. But it is an excellent show. So I don't want to overhype it, but I really don't think that I am. So
I think the listeners have 4 shows that they need to subscribe to right now.
Absolutely. Science Versus, Mystery Show, The Distance, and First Day Back, all from excellent groups, excellent producers, all women hosts, completely coincidental, at least as far as I'm concerned. And I hope that this will help round out your subscription list, folks. I hope that you would give all of these at least a couple of episode try, and I really believe that you will end up loving them all. So, before we wrap things up, Molly, thank you so much for joining me on episode 52 of the Podcast Digest.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm glad we could sit down and talk about our favorite podcast together, and hopefully some people got some new ones out of this.
That is the goal of these recommendation shows, folks. Before we go, folks, tell everyone where they can find you on the interwebs, couple things, and they'll find something else to add to their subscription list.
Guys, you can check us out at couplethingspodcast.com. We are on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can find us on Twitter at couplethingspod and Facebook and Instagram. And we hope you give us a shot.
And you should. And folks, if you haven't already, as I mentioned, this is now my 3rd mention of Couple Things Podcast in my 52 episode run so far. Folks, I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't completely believe in what those 2 couples out of Cincy are doing. You will definitely enjoy adding that show to your subscription list if you've not done so already. If you haven't, get on that. Believe me, it's worth it. Folks, that'll do it for episode 52 of the Podcast Digest. A rating or review, Stitcher or iTunes or anywhere else. Tell a friend, tweet about it, like it on Facebook, all that fun stuff. I would be forever indebted. Even longer than that, if you check out the post on the podcastdigest.info that talks about all the merchandise that's currently out there. I know my mom bought something. So if you would like to join my mom in that support, I would greatly appreciate it. That's for sure. Thanks for listening, folks. My name's Dan Lizette with the Podcast Digest, and I will talk to you again next week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.